Welcome to another discussion about World War II with Mr. Regas. Now, in our last episode, we went over the causes of World War II. Now, I like to emphasize that the causes of the war are really like the important thing because what do we want to learn from history, right? We want to learn why bad things happened or why big events like world wars occurred in the first place. So that's why I like to spend a lot of time going over that. Now, World War II is fascinating. We could spend a year talking only about it. We're going to do a really quick summary. Now, I want to start with a quick recap, though, of the lead up to World War II. Now, I might have mentioned in the previous episode, there is a train of thought amongst some historians that, well, the two wars are quite connected and there's almost no true separation between them. There's also some debate about when World War II actually started. So let's just go through some of those initial lead up points. Now, one of the first things we see is in 1931 and 1932, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. This is a serious event in mainland China and Asia. We see hundreds of thousands of people massacred in Nanjing. And what does the League of Nations do? Well, they practice their policy of appeasement, right? So we got the invasion of Manchuria. Later on, 1935 to 1937, we have the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, as it was called at the time. You might remember that Emperor Haile Selassie went to the League of Nations and pled for them to intervene because they had said they made that commitment, yet nothing happened there. We also have, in 1936 to 1939, the Spanish Civil War. Another significant event, we see German and Russian troops intervening here. So it's kind of like a proxy war. Fascism versus democracy, communism versus fascism. That's a more accurate depiction. Now, Spain doesn't end up getting involved in World War II, but a fascist leader does get put into Spain's control. We also see here the beginning of kind of the attacks against civilians. Later on, we see Germany and Austria join together in what's called Anschluss. That's in 1938. Now, the Paris Peace Conference and Treaty of Versailles after World War I, it explicitly said that they cannot do that. Yet in 1938, they do that. You also have Germany annexing part of Czechoslovakia, the German-speaking region, because with the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler into power, he wanted to unify all German speakers. So leading up to 1939, we have a few different events in the world. The League of Nations at the time, again, they're practicing appeasement, so they're not doing anything about it. And this leads us to 1939. The war begins. So on September 1st, 1939, 4:45 a.m., 1.5 million troops from Germany invaded Poland. So here we go, sweeping into Poland. Now the German Air Force, or the Luftwaffe, they bombed first. They bombed the Polish Air Force bases, took them out. The Navy attacked the Polish Navy. And even though the Polish tried to get their troops together, it was unsuccessful. Part of the problem here was that now Poland was actually anticipating that they would get invaded, but they thought that it wouldn't be until 1942. So they weren't ready. This is 3 years earlier. So they put together their army, but Germany's practicing something called blitzkrieg warfare. They come in quick like lightning. That's what blitzkrieg means. And they take them out. Now, here's a little thing too. 3 days before Hitler invaded Poland, he renounced his non-aggression pact with Poland. So he's not a big loyalty guy. So Hitler wanted to invade Poland to unite Germany with East Prussia. They called it the Polish Corridor. Now, right after this happens, though, 2 days later, France and Britain declare war on Germany. So this is the event that most people say sets off World War II. Canada, different from World War I, they wait until September 10th to declare war against Germany. So they wanted to be seen as a separate entity from the British. The USA at this time, they remain neutral. They said, we're not being provoked directly, and so we're not getting involved. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, what he does, because he anticipated USA joining the war at some point, he was supplying a lot of armaments to the United Kingdom and whatnot. So again, Germany wants to close off that Polish corridor. Canada in the war. Now, this is just a very brief few points on it. Over 1 million Canadians served in World War II. 44,000 killed, another 54,000 wounded. This is a huge toll on a small country. Like, we only had a population of around 11 or 12 million. So about 10% of the population served in the army. This is huge. It cost Canada about $21.8 billion. And by the end of World War II, Canada had the world's fourth largest air force, the fifth largest navy. This is huge. Canada becomes a powerhouse during this time period. The war also accelerates Canada's transformation into an industrialized nation. And if you remember, World War II starts at the end of the dirty 30s. So countries are in rough shape. Now, Germany invades Poland, and it just kind of like sits there. Nothing is really happening. No one's going and attacking Poland or attacking German troops. And so Russia decides, and my apologies for the blurry map. This is just to kind of show where things are happening. The Soviet Union, so the USSR under Joseph Stalin, they decide, well, you know what? Finland is looking mighty appealing. And so November 30th, 1939, the USSR sweeps into Finland. This is called the Winter War. At the time, also, you might remember, Stalin and Hitler had a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So they said, we will have no aggression against each other for at least 10 years. Now, the Soviets wanted Finnish territory, partially to protect their capital of St. Petersburg. Some people think they wanted to install a puppet government. Essentially, though, this turned into it made Soviet Union a bit of a laughingstock. USSR had a huge army. 450,000 Soviet soldiers were sent. Now, especially us living in Canada, we understand that winter gets cold. Temperatures went as low as minus 43 degrees Celsius in this time. They started bombing Helsinki, the capital. Now, the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, he said to the League of Nations, we're not bombing. Rather, we're dropping humanitarian aid. This is what he said. And so this was sarcastically dubbed Molotov breadbaskets by the Finnish people. The Finnish people were ill-equipped. They didn't have much ammunition. They didn't have anti-tank weapons. We start seeing the Molotov cocktail getting used and mass-produced, but the cold weather gave them some assistance. They used camouflage clothing. They blended in with the snow, and they used guerrilla warfare. So even though they had a small amount of troops, they were able to inflict massive losses on the Soviet army. Now, thousands of Soviets died of frostbite, and by the springtime, tanks start getting bogged down in the thaw, and so the Soviet Union and Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland gives 11% of their territory. This was 30% of their economy. But one of the things that we see is Hitler notices, maybe Stalin's not that intimidating. So we start to see Hitler realize maybe he has a chance against the Soviet Union. We also see Germany invading Norway around this time. Norway has a bunch of iron ore, which you need for war. And what we see here is the British Prime Minister starting to lose confidence of his country. There's a couple pictures from the Winter War. Now, a little bit about German blitzkrieg warfare. So it translates to lightning war. And again, there's a link here for a video that you can watch. This is a military tactic which tries to create chaos and disorganization. It was extremely effective. Germany invaded Poland in 26 days, Belgium in 18, the Netherlands in 5, and France in 6 weeks. Germany had taken all of Western Europe in under 6 weeks. So World War II plays out drastically different than World War I. We don't see the same sort of stalemate occurring that happened in World War I when the Germans get close to Paris. So the invasion of Belgium. Now, one thing to keep in mind too, when we're looking at these dates, the invasion of Poland was September 1st, 1939. This is a big gap in time. So now all of a sudden, it's May 10th, 1940. Germany starts sweeping through towards France. So we have the first tank battle, and even though it only lasted 18 days, the Belgians, similar to World War I, had incredible bravery and toughness. French and British tried to support the Belgians, but they were outnumbered and overmatched. Belgium was just on the defensive here. So they had gun bunkers, but the artillery was much too strong, and German blitzkrieg made short work of the Belgian defenses. You then have the invasion of the Netherlands. One of the tactics used here was German paratroopers dropped into key positions behind Dutch defenses. So they were able to essentially sandwich them and attack them. In the invasion of the Netherlands, we also see bombing of civilian cities, so such as Rotterdam. This is something where we see the way war is going to be fought is changed from World War I. Civilians become the main targets here. And then the invasion of France. So also known as the Battle of France or the Fall of France. Germany sweeps in. They end up capturing basically all of Western Europe. Now, Italy, if you remember, under Mussolini, allied to Germany. And so Germany and Italy suffered quite a few casualties in the fall of France. The Allies suffered many more, though. So France had built these massive defenses around the Maginot Line. This was on the border of Germany. Now, similar to the Schlieffen Plan, they knew that there were fortifications in that section of France, so Germany wanted to avoid it. But this time, they just skipped the Maginot Line and swept into France. Now, the Maginot Line is kind of talked about as a bit of a joke now, where somebody sinks an immense amount of resources into something that ends up being useless. So sometimes the term Maginot Line is used that way today. Now, from the invasion of Belgium at the beginning of May, it only took until the 22nd of June for Hitler to capture Western Europe and France. This is a real picture of Hitler in Paris at the Eiffel Tower. So on the 22nd of June, Hitler forces France to surrender. And just to rub salt in the wound and make it that much more humiliating, he forces them to surrender at the Armistice Wagon, the exact place where the Germans surrendered and signed the treaty with the French at the end of World War I. So we see that tactic of humiliation used here. Now, the armistice wagon ended up getting destroyed at some point in the war, so it's not around anymore. Now, as you see, the Battle of Dunkirk, this is before the fall of France, but essentially what's happening is France is trying to be defended. We have France, India, the United Kingdom, Morocco, Polish Free Army, Belgium, Canada, Netherlands, all these versus Germany. But by May 26th, the Allies could see that the Battle of France was going to be lost. So to try to save as many troops as possible, they retreat to Dunkirk and plan a massive invasion. So the plan was, well, let's get our troops back to the UK. The British Navy was being held back by German U-boats. So the British government called on civilian vessels to sail across the English Channel to Dunkirk to aid. The result of this, though, is that France is lost. Now, they do manage to save over 300,000 Allied troops, who do end up going back and fighting in the liberation of Europe. But the Allies lose about 61,000 compared to the 20,000 of the Axis. And so the Germans, what they did leading up to this was they reached the coast, cutting off the French First Army and the Belgian Army. They swung north along the coast, threatening to capture the ports and trap the British and French before they could evacuate. But then the Germans halted, because again, to be able to evacuate was quite a spectacular feat. Now, there's a myth that Hitler gave the order to evacuate. In reality, it was a colonel general, or a Generalobersten, Gerd von Rundstedt and Gunther von Klug. They suggested the German forces around the Dunkirk pocket should cease their advance and consolidate to avoid an Allied breakout. So the German army halted for 3 days, and this gave the Allies enough time to organize evacuation and build a defensive line. So there's still heavy casualties. The British lost alone 68,000 soldiers, but some called the evacuation the miracle of Dunkirk, because it's a miracle any were able to make it back. So here's Dunkirk. Here's some images. Now, in the period of time leading up to the evacuation of Dunkirk, that's a huge chunk of time. It's like 8 months. And so what started to happen was that in Britain, they started calling it the phony war. Why wasn't Britain doing anything? Like, Poland had been captured, USSR's in Finland, but nobody was doing anything. So they called it the phony war. And eventually, this is how the Prime Minister Chamberlain was overthrown in a vote of non-confidence, and Winston Churchill then came to power. But what happens next is what we call the Battle of Britain. So the Royal Air Force, they defend the United Kingdom against the Nazi Luftwaffe attacks. Now, there's 2 different dates that we see here. The British say the Battle of Britain was from the 10th of July until the 31st of October 1940. Germans say it was a single campaign lasting from July 1940 to June 1941. The goal, though, was to try to compel the British to a peace settlement, so bomb them into submission. France was already overwhelmed. The British retreated to Dunkirk, so Britain also faced invasion by sea. So there were many bombing raids happening at night time. 43,000 British civilians were killed. Now, this didn't end up having much of an impact on Britain's war effort, but nonetheless, we do see a lot of Britain, especially London, getting destroyed during this time period. There's still to this day, when people are doing construction in cities like London, they sometimes find bombs that haven't gone off yet. Here's a few images from the bombings of London. Also different from World War I, where British cities didn't come under attack. Now, Vichy France. When France gets overrun by Germany, France becomes a vassal state of the Nazis. So it was headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain. From 1940 to 1942, Germans and Italians occupied northern and southeastern France. Following Allied invasions in North Africa in 42, southern France was also occupied by Germany and Italy to protect coastlines. So Petain's government collaborated with Nazi Germany. Millions of French were used as labor in the German war effort. And during this time period, there was also an effort led by Charles de Gaulle called Free France. So they fought against the Axis power. Whereas what we see during World War II is there's time periods when the Allies are actually fighting against French troops. Now the capital of Free France, at first we had in Brazzaville over here, and then we have it in Algiers, and then in London. Now, one thing to keep in mind too that's kind of interesting, just off the coast of Newfoundland, we have a couple French islands. Those French islands, St. Pierre and Miquelon, at one point were sided with Nazi Germany. So just a few kilometers off the coast of Canada. Now, eventually, when the Allies invade France, Vichy France relocates to Germany and they hold out there till the end. Now, the Axis begins making mistakes. And again, this is a quick run through of World War II. So Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, Italy invades Greece, Germany invades Russia, and Hitler declares war on the USA. These are some of the events that end up leading to the end of World War II. So Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. So let's move over to Hawaii. Is not really on this map, or is it? There we go. Hawaii. North America, USA. Japanese launch a surprise attack December 7th, 1941. They wanted complete control over the Pacific Ocean, but they had to take out the USA if they were going to do this. Now, this ends up leading the USA to declaring war on Japan and entering World War II. So the USA holds out for a couple years, but this pulls them in. Japan and the US end up fighting many battles, most of which are focused in this Pacific region during World War II. Now, just after this, Germany has to declare war on the USA as well, because Germany and Japan are allies. Germany didn't want to bring USA into the war. USA is huge. They were well on their way to conquering all of Europe prior to the USA entering the war. And so on the same day Germany did, USA also declares war on Germany. So Germany's now at war in Europe, Africa, Middle East, and at sea. Too many fronts to fight on. So Italy invades Greece. Again, Europe is under German control for the most part. So Italy, they decide, you know what? Let's take over Greece. Mussolini's feeling like a little bit of a small guy compared to Hitler. So he wants to impress Hitler. Like, oh, Hitler, look at me. I can do this too. So Mussolini invades Greece, but they counterattack and push back 500,000 Italian troops quite easily. So this pisses Hitler off because he now has to take his troops away from other regions in Europe and bring them into Italy to help Mussolini. You can imagine this annoyed him quite a bit. This ends up being quite costly to Hitler as well, because what we're going to see is we see German troops over here in USSR, but when you have to relocate those to go to Greece, now you have less to be fighting over there. I'm going to clean this map up a bit. So Germany invades Russia. 1938, Germans and Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact. They're not going to attack each other for 10 years. Well, Hitler had different plans. Now, Hitler, what he wanted to do was essentially control all of Europe. So I'm shading it in. This was going to be what he called Lebensraum, living's room. This was space for the German people to live. Now, of course, that meant forcibly relocating and killing people that lived there. That was irrelevant to Hitler. So Hitler, being a man of his word, he breaks his pact with Stalin. And he invades Russia, or the Soviet Union. He assumed this was going to be quick and decisive, just like France and Belgium was. Well, let's think back. What has history told us about people invading Russia? Didn't work in World War I. Didn't work with Napoleon. It becomes a disaster for Hitler as well. So they come in and they attack the Soviet Union. If Italy hadn't gone to war with Greece, Hitler would have invaded in the summer. However, he ended up invading in the wintertime, and this is a disaster. So 4 million soldiers are a part of the Axis force. This is huge. Started 22nd of June 1941, covered 2,000 miles. However, now they're fighting a two-front war. Their logistical preparations were inadequate. Industrial preparations were yet to begin. And so the Germans are coming as conquerors, or not as conquerors, but as liberators. They said, we're going to enslave the Slavic population, exterminate the Jews, and war in the East became an ideological struggle. However, the Russian weather saw heavy rains and November frosts. Germans didn't have winter clothes. So the Soviets counterattack at the gates of Moscow. And they stopped the Germans in December. So there was almost a slow retreat imitating Napoleon's defeat in 1812. And so the spring thaw march in 1942 brings operations to a halt. And now there's a two-front war. Here we see the Battle of Stalingrad. Now this is in southern Russia, or southern Soviet Union here. August 42 to February 43. Potentially the bloodiest battle of all time. Close to 2 million were killed, thousands of which were civilians. The city was an important industrial center. They produced artillery. And so Hitler proclaimed that once he took Stalingrad, all the city's male residents would be killed and the women deported. So he was going to just use the city's industrial facilities to help his war effort. Now, Stalin ordered all Russians strong enough to take up arms and defend the city. They shipped grain out and cattle out of the city, but the 400,000 plus residents were not evacuated, so they were supposed to inspire troops with their presence. Now, the Russians formed a defensive ring around the city by November 1942, trapping 300,000 Axis troops and the Sixth Army. So Russia's blockade limited access to supplies, so the German forces slowly starved, and Russians seized upon the weakness during the harsh winter. By 1943, Russian troops retake the city and capture nearly 100,000 German soldiers. Most died in prison camps from disease or starvation. This is the biggest defeat in the history of the German army. You also have tens of thousands of civilians dying. So this is a complete tragedy. The city was ruined. As supplies were cut off, civilians had no access to food. There's stories of some turning to eating the wallpaper in their homes during the winter just to have something going into their stomach. So just horrendous conditions here. This turned the tide of World War II, though, in favor of the Allied forces. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning at this point, though, I'm going to zoom out on the map. The USA, for the most part, is focusing their efforts on the Pacific. So the USA they're kind of caught up over there. Britain's getting bombed. But over here, Germany's just got control. But Stalin and the USSR is left alone. So there's quite a series of diplomatic events going on between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. Stalin did not like that he was holding up the Germans and the Soviet Union all on his own. They were losing many people. Many people. And so Roosevelt, he kind of kept Stalin on the hook. They were worried that he would eventually capitulate to the Nazis and say, all right, we're going to work with you. But they were able to keep Stalin on their side for long enough until we see the invasion of Europe by Allied forces. So fighting in the Pacific. This is where we see the most American involvement until the Allied invasion of Europe. There's four main areas of conflict. So we got China, the Central Pacific, Southeast Asia, and the Southwest Pacific. So this is a large area. One of the battles we see happen a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor is the Battle of Midway. So beginning of June 1942. Admiral Yamamoto viewed the Midway operation as a decisive battle. They wanted to destroy the American power in the Pacific. So they thought, well, the US base located at Midway Island, we're going to take them out. Japanese had 4 aircraft carriers. 3 out of 4 were sunk in this battle. So what ends up happening is the US is able to destroy a large chunk of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese now go from being on the offensive to the defensive. This is a huge turning point in the war. We then have the first attempt at recapturing Western Europe. So in something called the Dieppe Raid. So August 1942. This was an Allied assault on the port of Dieppe in France. 6,500 infantrymen, 5,000 of which were Canadians, landed on the beach, but they ended up getting trapped immediately against superior firepower. Now, the Dieppe raid is seen as a massive failure. However, it was also a learning curve and a big lesson for Allied troops. So 3,623 of the 6,086 troops were either captured or killed, a casualty rate of 68%. One of the reasons they saw as failure here was that they did not do enough aerial bombardment. So again, France is under the control of the Nazis. So they try to sweep in, and it is not work. It's a failure. The lessons, though, learned here were used for the future invasion of France. So even though it was a loss, they learned a lot from it. Vice Admiral Lord Mountbatten said, here's the mind behind the raid. I have no doubt that the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe. For every man who died in Dieppe, at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy in 1944. Churchill remarked, my impression, Jubilee, is that the results fully justified the heavy cost. And he said that it was a Canadian contribution of the greatest significance to final victory. Now, the Germans used this failed raid to boost morale. Propaganda was created and the Allies were viewed as incompetent. So both sides ended up getting something from it, but the Allies learned. Next up, we see the invasion of Northern Africa. Now, the reason this happens is this is all under German control. So how do you take it over? Dieppe didn't work. So what they did first was they swept in through North Africa. So this started 10th of June 1940 to the 13th of May 1943. It was called Operation Torch. Now this is 8th of November 1942. And this was 3 days. Now there were British troops in Egypt already, and they undertook defensive measures. So Operation Torch begins, and what this does is it allows Allies to move forward with the invasion of Sicily and the Italian campaign. So they used North Africa as a staging ground. They sweep in. It was a massive landing force. And from there, they take this route to Sicily and to mainland Italy. And this is how they start the invasion of Western Europe. So this brings us to the Italian campaign. First, it was in Sicily, 10th of July, 1943. Allies drive the Axis from the island. They open up sea lanes for merchants. When this happens, we end up seeing a vote of non-confidence against Mussolini. So he's arrested, and we have Marshal Pietro Badoglio assuming the role of prime minister. Now, this whole time that Mussolini gets removed from power is kind of interesting. So he's moved around, he's imprisoned, but people were then very happy in Italy because they thought that Italy was going to be out of the war. But 2 years later, the new prime minister dissolves the fascist party, and he ends up continuing the war. So it's kind of confusing, though. What ends up happening is he negotiates an armistice with the Allies, but then the German troops rush in to take over Italy, and Italy declares war on Nazi Germany. But Mussolini creates an Italian social republic. And so you have Mussolini kind of gaining power again in the north, fighting against the south. So he creates this new government. The Italian government flees south. He worked as a puppet for the German Fuhrer. He carries out executions against fascists who betrayed him. This is including his own son-in-law. So Mussolini wants that power. Now, he ends up meeting quite a horrible death. 28th of April, 1945, he's caught while trying to escape. So they end up taking their corpses, they dump them in front of a Milan piazza. They're hung upside down from the roof of an Esso gas station and stoned from civilians. The Italian campaign, though, is brutal. Lasts until 1945. Over 25,000 Canadians were killed here. So the defeat of the Nazis. Well, following the entrance of the USA into World War II, it's inevitable that the Nazis are going to get defeated. British, Canadian, American, and Free Army troops are able to take back territories on the French coast, and they begin to push the Nazis back. Now this happens, or the liberation of Europe begins on what we call D-Day, June 6, 1944. And it lasts until May 5th, 1945, the day of German surrender. When this is happening, the Germans begin the final solution. So they begin executing Jewish people on a horrific rate as they attempt to hide the horrors of the Holocaust. Now, a little side note, though. Let's go back over here to Canada. Interesting enough, there were actually some conflicts that happened in Canada. One of them off the coast of Newfoundland on Bell Island. This was the only location attacked by the Germans in World War II. This was November 1942. So the Germans actually fired on the island. There were also German U-boats in the Cabot Strait and the St. Lawrence. So we see German U-boats in this area. They even found some German U-boats up around Labrador, some wrecks. There also, on June 1942, there was a Japanese submarine that shelled a lighthouse. It was called the Estevan Point Lighthouse on Vancouver Island. So there actually were some teeny little Axis attacks on Canada during this. Minor, but nonetheless, it was very real. So Operation Overlord. Again, the lessons from Dieppe are used here. This is an airborne and amphibian assault. 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel. Now, the beginning of the operation was called Operation Neptune. And so we have Normandy divided into 17 sectors with landing points including Juno, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Sword, and more. Canadians landed at Juno. 340 were killed on this day. One Canadian division actually advanced the furthest that day out of any Allied division. So Canadians had an amazing presence here. Heavy casualties on the beach, though. It was guarded with mines, barbed wire, machine guns, artillery. But one of the things they did was months before the invasion, Allies conducted Operation Bodyguard. This was designed to mislead the Germans as to the date and location of the invasion. Fake radio traffic made the Germans believe that there would be an attack on Norway and the landings would take place in July. This, though, sets the stage, and I'm skipping a ton of important battles, but essentially, once they take the coast of France, this allows them to sweep in and make their way to Germany. Here's a map showing the different landing points on D-Day. So Hitler's death. Well, the Allies are stretching. They're getting closer to Germany. Hitler knows his time is doomed. So on the 30th of April, 1945, he commits suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Now, 2 days before is when Mussolini was killed. So as soon as Mussolini's gone, Hitler knows he doesn't stand a chance. Now, there's all sorts of people who talk about conspiracy theories around Hitler's death. He did die. They've proved that those theories are wrong. People just like to have fun with that. But essentially, 1 day before this, he wed his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun. So in his little bunker there, he marries Eva Braun, and the two of them commit suicide together. Eva Braun with cyanide, Hitler with cyanide and a bullet. So Hitler didn't want to be made a spectacle of like Mussolini did, and that's why he does this. Now, Goebbels is put into power after this, but the Third Reich was admitting defeat. And so only a few days later, Germany surrenders. This, though, brings us to the end of World War II. So Western Europe has been taken back. The Soviets sweep in from the other direction into Germany. And so we're left with Japan. USA wanted a quick and definite victory to Japan. And so they call for unconditional surrender. Emperor Hirohito refuses. So they give Japan an ultimatum. Surrender or the USA would promptly and utterly destroy Japan. In the years leading up to this, there was an atomic race. So one of the things is called the Manhattan Project. This was the building of the atomic bombs. Canadians were involved in this as well, even though Canadians have never had nuclear bombs themselves. But there were test sites across the USA and some in Canada as well. Before this, though, Japan was suffering massive bombings. So it wasn't just nuclear bombs that dropped on Japan. The USA was practicing firebombing on it. So 67 cities in Japan. 100,000 people were killed in Tokyo in one night of bombings. 6 of Japan's major cities had been destroyed. So they decide, well, let's end this quick. And so they look at Hiroshima, port, industrial center, and major military headquarters, and Nagasaki, major military port, large shipbuilding and repair center. And they decide, we're going to take them out. Now, one of the things the USA did in these bombings of Japan leading up to the atomic bombs was they used to actually drop pamphlets on the cities, or leaflets. Over 63 million of these leaflets were dropped leading up to some of the different fire bombings. They would tell the people essentially, you're going to get bombed to get out of the cities. Now, they never did this for the atomic bombs. So on August 6, 1945, the USA drops the first atomic bomb. They called this one Little Boy. Now, this was approved by the United Kingdom and allowed under the Quebec Agreement. Following this bomb, which, this is just huge devastation. Now, they actually missed the target by 240 meters, but people on the ground see a flash of light followed by a loud booming sound. 70 to 80,000 people were killed, another 70,000 injured, 69% of the buildings destroyed. This is huge. But once the bomb is dropped, USA gives Japan a second chance at surrender. Japan refuses, though. And so on August 9th, 3 days later, USA drops the second bomb on Hiroshima. This one they called Fat Man. In Nagasaki, the bombings were confined to the hills and industrial areas mostly. There's some various death tolls. At least 35 to 40,000 were killed, though. In total, we see 129,000 deaths, mostly civilians. And this is the only use of nukes in history. This, though, ends up taking Japan out of the war. Here's some images from the nuclear bombs. Now, Emperor Hirohito, his surrender speech was quite powerful. He said, "Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of military and naval forces, the diligence and assiduity of our servants of the state, and the devoted service of our 100 million people, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy now possesses a new and terrible weapon, with the power to destroy many innocent lives and do incalculable damage. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects, or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers." I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides here. A little too far. Following the end of the war, two major powers emerge: USA and the Soviet Union. Now, Japanese surrender on the US battleship Missouri. They're charged with war crimes in Nanking, and they agree to harsh military restrictions. And then we have the USA and Soviet Union coming out as the two major world powers. Here we see a new map of Europe drawn again. This time under the influence of two competing ideologies. We have it split through East and West. The Eastern Europe fell under the influence of the Soviet Union, or the Iron Curtain. The West under the influence of the United States and Great Britain. The city of Berlin was split in Eastern Germany. This then leads into the Cold War. We also see Israel becoming a nation for the Jewish people here. Another significant event. Now, that was a quick summary of the most destructive war in human history. Did I do it justice? No. But nonetheless, it gives you an idea. A quick little recap of everything. We have the policy of appeasement leading up to it. And so it starts with Germany going to Poland, Russia going to Finland, Germany then sweeping in, taking Western Europe. We then have battle in the West with Hawaii, battle in the Pacific, Battle of Britain. So eventually, for the Allies to get involved, they sweep into North Africa. The Germans are also attacking the Soviet Union. But by sweeping up through Italy, enough German troops are drawn away from Western Europe that they come in and they take over. That's World War II. Hope you enjoyed it.